Chapter 6. Chamberlain. Lord Anthony Norwood slammed his fist against the desk that stood in the centre of his office, causing the whole thing to shake violently. He could not fathom how Flack and Middleton had managed to elude his men for a second time. "Explain to me, Mr. Leach, how you and your men were incapable, it seems, of being able to complete even the simplest of tasks." His eyes bored into the face of his chief intelligence officer as he openly expressed his anger. "Well, my lord, they were prepared for us, and—" he started to say before trailing off as his master erupted. "Get out!" roared Lord Norwood. "I don't want to hear excuses. I want results. I will deal with them myself. Clearly, if you want something done correctly, one must do it oneself. Get out of my sight. And find Chamberlain, now!" he bellowed at the Weasley man. Mr. Leach almost tripped over his own feet in his attempt to beat a hasty retreat from his master's office before something really nasty happened to him. He had seen what his master was capable of when he was in one of those moods, and he didn't want to stick around to find out if it would happen to him. He valued his life far too much to risk fanning the flames of his master's rage any further. He quickly sought out Chamberlain, who was in one of the hangars preparing for the long-awaited expedition. Nervously he addressed the man. "His lordship requests your presence." The man really intimidated him. He was a real savage, and extremely sadistic. "Failed again, have we?" A cruel smile spread across Chamberlain's face as the rhetoric left his lips. Not wanting to get embroiled in Chamberlain's favourite new game of baiting him, Mr. Leach shrank away from the man. Chamberlain really put the fear of God into him, far more than his master ever could. Mr. Leach wasn't even sure if he was human. The man felt little, if any, pain, and took great pleasure from inflicting it on others. If there was ever such a thing as a definitive psychopath, then Chamberlain would be it. Mr. Leach had once witnessed Chamberlain torture a man. It had not been a pretty sight. The event had haunted Leach's dreams for the next few weeks. Chamberlain was a master of the old arts. One of his favourite torture techniques was to tightly wrap his victims in strands of wire. Their soft flesh would protrude through any gaps between the strands, which he would then slice off one piece at a time. It was extremely painful and could be maintained for weeks before a victim would die. During that period, his victims would tell him whatever he wanted to know. Chamberlain would taunt them by running the edge of his blade across the wire that bound them. He had watched the fear in their eyes as the sound of the metal blade of his knife grating along the wire registered, the whites of their eyes becoming ever more petrified. Eventually, everyone would break down, pleading for the pain to end, not that he ever obliged their request for mercy. He enjoyed it too much for that, even if he knew they had no more information to give. It was under this constant fear that Mr. Leach operated, a fear that one day his mistakes would give him a direct ticket to the wrong side of Chamberlain's blade. Chamberlain completed the task he'd been doing, and headed off towards his lordship's office in the main house. He knocked once at the door and waited to hear the familiar tones of his master's stern voice. "Enter." He opened the door and walked through into the study. "Ah, Chamberlain, good to see you. I hope all is on schedule." His master's voice softened slightly as he smiled, greeting his right-hand man. "Sit down, we have much to discuss." "Thank you, my lord," Chamberlain said as he settled himself down into one of the two red leather armchairs positioned in front of his master's walnut desk. Yet again Mr. Leach has failed to take care of Middleton and Flack. Nevertheless, he has acquired information that they are headed towards St. Michael's Mount, so we will deal with them once and for all on the island. This may be to our advantage, as I was already of the belief that one of the books we are searching for could well be hidden somewhere on the island. I can't be completely sure, but I have read references alluding to this. We shall dispose of them and take possession of the book at the same time. I shall oversee this operation personally to make sure all goes to plan. You will accompany me. I want you to select a handful of men for the task. Make sure you have enough equipment to carry this out. I will prepare 3 jeeps for the journey and teach Mr. Leach the lesson of what it means to fail. Don't kill him. He does have his uses, and therefore I may yet still require his services. Is that clear? Lord Norwood finished addressing Chamberlain and waited for a reply. Crystal clear, sir. Will you require anything else? Hoping that he would be allowed to bring some of his toys with him. Ever since he'd heard of Middleton and Flack, a great desire had grown inside him to torture those two. 2 men who seemed to be hell-bent on meddling in his master's affairs. He wanted to see the fear in their eyes before he dispatched them into the abyss. Yes, bring your toys. I'd like to find out what Flack knows about our plans, and how big his network is, Lord Norwood added, spotting that slightly baleful look on Chamberlain's face. Chamberlain felt a wave of pleasure spreading over his body at his master's request. The possibility that his daydreams may finally be enacted filled him with delight. He considered those 2 men to be as skilful as himself at causing chaos. It shall be done, my lord. Good. Be ready by tomorrow morning, and I want to put an end to those 2 as soon as possible. You may go. His master finished and turned his attention back to the notes he'd been working on at his desk. Chamberlain left the study. First he was going to seek out Mr. Leach. He knew he was going to enjoy re-educating him. He loved seeing the little man's facial contortions whenever their paths crossed. He caught up with the man in the main gatehouse of the estate. As he entered the building, Mr. Leach's face dropped. He could sense that for whatever reason Chamberlain was there, it was not a good one. Leach, give me your hand. A thin, twisted smile appeared across Chamberlain's face as he snarled at the man. No, please, I can do better. I won't make a mistake again. Please, I beg you, the man replied in a shaky voice. His mind was now running through all the gruesome outcomes that could happen. His face had almost turned completely white as the blood drained away from his face. Fear was his master now. Don't be a fool. You've had your chances. Give me your hand before I decide to take something else, Chamberlain snapped. No, I shan't, Leach replied defiantly. You 2 men, hold him, Chamberlain exclaimed, turning to the 2 guards in the gatehouse. After a small scuffle with Mr. Leach, they managed to take hold of the little man and held out his left arm. The man was visibly shaking as dread spread over him. Chamberlain produced a small pair of bolt cutters from his pocket. Mr. Leach tried to wriggle out of the 2 men's grasp, but they were too strong. Escape was futile. He pleaded in vain, but Chamberlain ignored the man's cries. With a single movement, he put the jaws of the cutters around the base of Leach's ring finger. As the blades tightened down around the finger, Mr. Leach let out a blood-curdling howl. The metallic sound of the jaws scraping as they bit into the flesh of the man's finger were clearly audible, before they met the bone in the middle. There was an ugly piercing crack as the razor-sharp blades cleaved the bone, blood spurting onto the carpet of the gatehouse. The finger dropped to the floor with a gentle thud. Leach had passed out. his body drooping between the two guards. The bloody stump of his left hand now just oozed blood as it started to clot. "Take him to the surgeon. He's making a mess all over the carpet," commanded Chamberlain. The two men had to drag Leach's limp body out of the gatehouse and across to the surgeon's tent that had been erected on the front lawn of the estate. It had been set up to deal with the casualties from the night of the explosions. Lord Norwood had originally decided it would be useful to employ the surgeon on a temporary basis for the upcoming expedition, and it was a fortunate coincidence that he had been at the house making preparations for that expedition when all hell had broken loose. The surgeon looked up from behind an operating table as they entered. He was just finishing off redressing a wound for one of the security staff that had taken some shrapnel in his leg, courtesy of the mixologists. "Try to keep this one clean," the surgeon said as he turned to see the new arrivals. "I see Chamberlain has finally been unleashed upon Mr. Leach. Put him on that table over there, and I'll see what can be done with him. Once I've finished here," the surgeon said bluntly, gesturing towards another cold steel table in the centre of the tent, surrounded by two trolleys laden with small silver trays adorned by surgical instruments. The two men nodded and rather laboriously slung Mr. Leach upon the slab before leaving the tent to return to their duties.